He addressed Oldfield by name. He said, "I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started."
"I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started. I reckon your boys are letting you down, George. They can't be much good, can they?"
The night of January 2nd, 1981, was cold in the Broomhall area of Sheffield, as winter nights in South Yorkshire tend to be. Sergeant Robert Ring and Police Constable Robert Hydes were working a routine patrol through a neighbourhood known, as it had been known for some years, as a place where women sold sex to men in parked cars along the curbs of quiet residential streets. This was the kind of patrol that officers expected to produce nothing more significant than a few uncomfortable encounters, a few names run through the system, a few vehicles waved on their way. It was a Friday night in January in a northern English city, and almost nothing about it was unusual. At approximately 10:50 in the evening, the two officers noticed a Rover V8 motor vehicle parked on Melbourne Avenue. Through the windscreen they could see a man in the driver's seat and a woman beside him. They pulled alongside, and the driver rolled down his window. He was a broad-shouldered man with dark, curly hair, a thick beard, and an untroubled expression. He gave no indication of concern. He told the officers his name calmly, Peter Sutcliffe. He provided an address in Bradford, West Yorkshire, roughly 40 miles to the north. The woman beside him was Olivia Reevers, who was well known to police in the area. She and the man had been conducting negotiations for services of the kind that brought men to Broomhall after dark. Sergeant Ring radioed in the vehicle's registration plates. What came back stopped him. The plates on the Rover V8 did not belong to that vehicle. They had been removed from a different car entirely and fitted here. The plates were false. This changed the nature of the encounter considerably. Peter Sutcliffe was asked to step out of the car and was informed he would be taken into custody on suspicion of the false plates offence. Before they left the street, he made one request. He needed to urinate. The officers allowed it. Sutcliffe walked a short distance away from the car toward a large oil storage tank at the edge of the road and stepped into the darkness for perhaps a minute. He came back. He got into the police car. No one thought to search the area around the tank. At the station, the booking procedure was unremarkable. Peter Sutcliffe gave his details without hesitation. He was 34 years old, born June 2nd, 1946. He lived with his wife at 6 Garden Lane, Heaton, Bradford. He worked as a lorry driver. He was pleasant in a way that officers later described as neither nervous nor performative, simply present in the way that cooperative people are present. Olivia Rivers, contacted and interviewed separately, confirmed everything he had told them about his name and confirmed that she knew him from the area. The cells closed. The night ended. On the morning of January 3rd, Sergeant Robert Ring drove back to Melbourne Avenue. He would be asked many times afterward why he did this, and his answers were consistent. Professional instinct. Something that had not resolved itself properly in his mind during the drive back to the station the previous night. Something about the stop that had not been fully examined. He went to the area near the oil storage tank and searched carefully in the darkness around it. And there, tucked against the wall and the tank, he found a ball-peen hammer and a knife. The items were brought to the station. They were photographed and logged. The man who had hidden them, Peter Sutcliffe, was still being held on the registration matter, and now the conversation changed. He was asked about the weapons. He said he had put them there because he did not want to be found with them. He did not yet say why. And then a detective, doing a routine cross-reference of the name Peter Sutcliffe against the major inquiry files held by the West Yorkshire Metropolitan Police, found something that required him to read the entry again, then to call for a senior officer. Peter Sutcliffe's name was in the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry files. Not once, not twice, not 3 times or 4. His name appeared 9 times in 9 separate interview records from 9 separate contacts with the inquiry between November 1977 and November 1980. He had been spoken to in connection with a traceable £5 note found with one of the victims. He had been spoken to because his car tyres matched impressions found near crime scenes. He had been spoken to as part of general canvasses of the Bradford and Leeds areas. He had been spoken to, most recently, just 6 weeks before his arrest in Sheffield, in connection with the murder of Jacqueline Hill, the last of the 13 victims. 9 times, over 4 years, officers investigating the most wanted criminal in British history had sat across a table from Peter William Sutcliffe of Garden Lane, Heaton, Bradford, and released him. When the call went out to the major inquiry team, and senior detectives drove to Sheffield to hear what had been found, the silence when they were given Sutcliffe's name, by all accounts of those present, lasted some time. The formal interview of Peter Sutcliffe in connection with the Yorkshire Ripper murders began on January 4th, 1981. He was told that he was a suspect. He asked to speak with his solicitor. The solicitor arrived. After consultation, Sutcliffe agreed to speak. The interview ran late into the evening and resumed the following morning. On January 5th, 1981, Peter Sutcliffe asked to speak privately with Detective Inspector Peter Smith. Smith sat down, and Sutcliffe said, "I think you had better sit down. I am the Yorkshire Ripper." The confession that followed occupied the better part of 2 days. Sutcliffe described each of the 13 murders attributed to the series. He provided details that only the perpetrator could have known. He was specific about geography, about weapons, about the order of events. He described returning to John Jordan's body after her death to search for a £5 note he had given her. He described going back to the concealed body of Yvonne Pearson and placing a newspaper there. He was methodical about all of it, in a manner that the detectives who took the statement described, in interviews given years later, as something they had never encountered before and hoped never to encounter again. He also told them something that would define his subsequent legal case, that in 1967, while working as a gravedigger in Bingley, he had heard the voice of God speaking to him from the gravestone of a Polish man. The voice had told him that he had a divine mission. The mission was to clean the streets. The mission, as Sutcliffe understood it and eventually chose to articulate it, was to kill prostitutes. Senior officers reviewing the confession were skeptical of this element. The careful planning that characterized all 13 murders, the return to scenes to recover evidence, the successful maintenance of a normal exterior across 9 separate police interviews and 5 years of crimes, was not the behavior of a man acting on impulsive religious compulsion. Their skepticism would become relevant at trial. But that is a later part of this story. This episode is about 13 women murdered in West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester between October 1975 and November 1980. It is about one of the largest and most expensive police investigations in British history and about the specific, layered ways that investigation failed to find the man it was looking for. It is about what the evidence tells us, what it honestly does not tell us, and what this case reveals about a society and its structures that allowed what happened to continue for 5 years when the evidence suggests it did not have to. I want to start with the women, because everything about this story makes more sense when you begin with the people at its centre. To understand what happened in West Yorkshire between 1975 and 1980, you have to understand the specific place and time in which it happened, because the world Peter Sutcliffe moved through was not an abstraction. It was a physical landscape, with streets and pubs and the particular social textures of post-industrial English city life, and the women who died in it were embedded in that landscape in ways that shaped who they were, and, in some cases, the specific vulnerabilities that were used against them. The West Yorkshire of the middle 1970s was a region in the complicated middle of a long economic transition. The wool mills that had defined towns like Bradford and Halifax for generations were closing or contracting. Manufacturing that had given the working class of Leeds and Huddersfield a particular kind of stability, not prosperity exactly, but structure, was beginning to erode in ways that would accelerate dramatically by the following decade. Unemployment was rising. Council estates built in the optimistic housing programs of the post-war years were now, 2 decades on, places of stretched municipal resource and concentrated poverty. The social infrastructure, the pub, the community centre, the working men's club, was still intact in the mid-70s, still functioning as the connective tissue of working-class social life, but the economic conditions that had supported it were already weakening. Leeds, the largest city in the county, was in the process of transformation. Its city centre was being redeveloped, the old covered markets and Victorian arcades existing alongside new shopping precincts and brutalist office blocks. Its inner neighbourhoods, particularly Chapeltown and Harehills to the north of the city centre, had gone through significant demographic change. Chapeltown had once been home to a large and established Jewish community that had since largely moved to the suburbs. Through the 1950s and 1960s, it had received substantial immigration from the Caribbean and South Asia, part of the post-war labour migration that had transformed many British cities. By the 1970s, it was a genuinely mixed area. West Indian families who had been in Leeds for 20 years alongside Pakistani and Indian families, alongside a white working-class population in the older terraced streets, alongside a transient population of bed-sit dwellers, newcomers, people between circumstances. Bradford, 15 miles to the west, had a parallel geography. Its red light area centred on Lum Lane in the Manningham district, an area of large Victorian terraced houses that had once been the substantial residences of wool merchants and had since been subdivided into flats and bedsits. Its population was predominantly South Asian by the 1970s, with a large Kashmiri community that had come to work in the mills. Around the edges of this community, in the ways that vulnerability tends to cluster at the edges of things, was the street-based sex trade that occupied Lum Lane after dark. These were not separate worlds. They were the same world, the ordinary world of northern English city life in the 1970s, with its pubs and chip shops and bus routes and terraced streets, and the sex trade that existed within it was not a separate phenomenon, but a consequence of the conditions of that world. Poverty, addiction, limited options for women with limited formal qualifications in an economy that offered them few paths and a social support system that was not designed to catch everyone who fell. The 13 women who were killed by Peter Sutcliffe were not all connected to sex work. 5 of the 13 had no connection to it whatsoever. But all 13 were living in the physical and social landscape of West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester in the 1970s, and each of them deserves to be known as the specific person she was. Wilma McCann was 28 years old in the autumn of 1975. She had been born Wilma Newlands on November 11, 1946, in Inverness, Scotland, a town on the Moray Firth in the Highlands, and she had come south as a young woman, as many young people from the Scottish Highlands came south in the post-war decades, looking for work and a different kind of life from the one available in the place where they had grown up. She settled in Leeds. She met and married Patrick McCann. They had 4 children: Richard, who was 9 by the time of her death, Sonia, who was 8, Angela, who was 7, and Paul, who was 6. By 1975, Wilma and Patrick had separated, and she was raising the 4 children alone in a council house at 9 Scott Hall Avenue in the Scott Hall area of Leeds, about 2 miles north of the city centre and within walking distance of the edge of Chapeltown. The social support available to a separated woman with 4 children in mid-1970s, Leeds was limited. The benefit system existed, but the amounts were insufficient for what a family of 5 required, and the bureaucracy surrounding it was not designed for ease of access. Wilma McCann managed. She managed in the way that women in her circumstances managed, by making economies, by relying on neighbours, by being resourceful in ways that left little room for error. She occasionally sold sex, though the extent and regularity of this is disputed in the accounts, and the question of whether it was occasional or more frequent tells you more about the difficulty of her financial position than about any other aspect of her character. Her neighbours described her as vivid. That is the word that comes up in the accounts of people who knew her. Vivid. She had energy, humour, a quality of engagement with the world around her that people remembered. She liked to go to the pub. She liked to dance. She could make people laugh. She worried about her children in the specific way that a lone parent worries, practically and constantly. About shoes that were too small, about the school fees that came due, about what they were eating when she was not watching. She had plans for them that were ordinary and particular and real. On the evening of October 29th, 1975, Wilma McCann left her 4 children at home, as she sometimes did, and went out. She went to the room at the top public house on Sheepscar, and then to the Boulevard pub on the same road. She drank. It was a Wednesday evening. She made her way out onto the road to try to get home. She did not have the bus fare. She was last seen around 1 in the morning, trying to hitch a ride back to Scott Hall Avenue. She had £1.88 in her pocket. Her home was a quarter of a mile away. At 7:40 in the morning of October 30th, 1975, a milkman named Alan Routledge was driving his delivery route near Prince Philip Playing Fields when he saw something on the grass embankment at the edge of the field. He stopped his float. He walked to the embankment. Wilma McCann was lying there on her back, her clothing disturbed, dead. At 9 Scott Hall Avenue that morning, 4 children woke up and found the house empty. They waited. Eventually, a neighbour discovered them and called the authorities. Richard McCann, who was 9 years old and the eldest, was old enough to know that something was very wrong. He would carry the memory of that morning for the rest of his life, and he would speak about it publicly in the years after the case was resolved, in words that added a dimension to the story that the original coverage had never provided. Emily Jackson was 42 years old when she was killed on January 20th, 1976. She had been born Emily Clark in Dewsbury and had lived most of her life in West Yorkshire. She was married to Sidney Jackson, and they had 3 grown or near-grown children together. The family had been going through a financially difficult period. Sidney's roofing business was struggling, and Emily had been supplementing the family's income by occasionally selling sex to men in the Chapeltown and Roundhay Road area of Leeds, something that Sidney knew about and had, according to evidence presented in later legal proceedings, accepted out of financial necessity rather than approval. Emily Jackson was not a full-time sex worker by any account. She was a wife and mother in a difficult patch, doing what she could. She had been a regular at the Gaiety Public House on Roundhay Road, where she was known and liked. On the evening of January 20th, 1976, she had gone to the Gaiety with Sidney. At some point during the evening she left to find a client. She was found the next morning in a yard off Roundhay Road, a short distance from where Wilma McCann had been found 3 months earlier. Irene Richardson was 28 years old at the time of her death in February 1977. She had been born in Glasgow and had moved to Leeds. By the time she was killed, she had been living a transient life. She had lodgings in different parts of the city at different times. Her children were in the care of the local authority, under circumstances that are not fully detailed in the public record, and she was selling sex in the Chapeltown area. She was found on February 5th, 1977, in Roundhay Park, which is a large public park to the north of Chapeltown. She had apparently been in the area on the evening of February 4th, and was found by joggers the following morning. She was 28 years old, which means she had been born in 1948 or 1949, which means she had grown up in post-war Glasgow and moved south, probably as a young adult, into a life that had not given her much to hold on to. Patricia Atkinson was known to everyone who knew her as Tina. She was 32 years old. She had been born in Chaddesden, Derbyshire, and had married Ray Atkinson, with whom she had 4 children. By 1977, she and Ray had separated, and Tina was living in a first-floor flat at 9 Oak Avenue in Bradford's Manningham district, close to Lum Lane. She sold sex in the area, and she had friends and a social life centred on the pubs around Lum Lane, where she was a familiar figure. She was found in her own flat on April 23, 1977. Peter Sutcliffe had been invited in, or had gained entry, had killed her there, and had left. The intimacy of being killed in one's own home, the place that should have been a refuge, is a specific detail about Tina Atkinson's case that is easy to pass over and that should not be passed over. Jane MacDonald was 16 years old. This is the moment in the list that requires a pause, not because Jane MacDonald's death was more important than the deaths of the women who came before her, but because of what her death revealed about how the deaths of those women had been understood, publicly and institutionally, in the months before. Jane MacDonald worked as a shop assistant at Grandways, a shoe shop in the Merrion Centre in Leeds city centre. She was a cheerful girl, by the accounts of everyone who knew her, the kind of person who made friends easily and who was liked by her colleagues at work. She had been out on the evening of June 26, 1977, with a group of friends at the Hofbrauhaus venue in Leeds. It was a summer evening, warm enough for the kind of night out that a 16-year-old looks forward to all week. She missed the last bus home and was walking through Chapeltown toward her family's home in Reginald Terrace, a walk she had likely taken before because it was a route between the city centre and the area where she lived. She was not in Chapeltown for any other reason. She was walking home. She was found the next morning in the back garden of a house in Reginald Street by 2 young boys who had come outside to play. She had been struck on the head and stabbed multiple times. She was 16 years old. The media coverage that followed Jane MacDonald's murder was qualitatively different from the coverage that had followed the preceding murders, and the difference was explicit. She was described in press reports as an innocent victim, as a girl who had no connection to vice, as someone who could have been anyone's daughter. These descriptions were accurate. They were also, implicitly, a contrast with the 5 women who had preceded her. The phrase innocent victim contained within it a negative space where the word innocent was not applied to Wilma McCann, who had left her children at home to go to the pub, or to Emily Jackson, who had been selling sex with her husband's knowledge, or to Irene Richardson, whose children were in care. The coverage did not accuse those women of deserving what had happened to them exactly. It simply did not extend to them the language of innocence that it extended, without hesitation, to Jane MacDonald. Jane MacDonald's father, Wilf MacDonald, gave press interviews in the days after his daughter's murder that were devastating in their simplicity. He said, "My daughter was a good girl. She never did anything wrong." He was speaking in the context of a public conversation in which the question of whether a murdered woman had done anything wrong was being treated as meaningful to her case. It was not meaningful. It had never been meaningful. But the fact that Wilf MacDonald had to say it, that he felt the need to establish his daughter's moral status as part of speaking about her murder, tells you a great deal about the frame through which the case was being understood in the summer of 1977. Jean Jordan was 20 years old. She had been born in Scotland, in Motherwell, and had moved to Manchester with her boyfriend Howard Moss, with whom she had 2 young children. She was selling sex in the Moss Side area of Manchester, in an environment very similar to Chapeltown in Leeds and Lum Lane in Bradford, inner-city streets with a concentrated poverty and a transient population and the conditions that produce street-based sex work. She was last seen on October 1, 1977, and her body was not discovered for 9 days. What was found in her handbag when her body was eventually located would become the most significant piece of forensic evidence in the entire 5-year inquiry, and I will return to it in the second movement. Yvonne Pearson was 21 years old. She lived in Bradford and had 2 small children. She sold sex in the Lum Lane area and was known in the social world of that neighbourhood. She was killed on January 21st, 1978, but her body was not found until April 26th, 1978, more than 3 months after her death. She had been concealed beneath an old sofa on waste ground, and the concealment had been effective enough that even in an area that was being searched, she was not found for months. Helen Ritker was 18 years old. She and her twin sister Rita had come to Huddersfield from the south of England as young teenagers, and by January 1978, both were selling sex in the Great Northern Street area of the town. They had developed between them what they thought of as a safety system. They would work in proximity to each other, noting the registration numbers of cars that clients drove, and they would agree to meet at a specific point at a specific time, so that if one of them did not appear, the other would know something was wrong. On January 31st, 1978, Helen Ritker did not appear at the agreed meeting point. Rita waited. Helen had already been killed. She was 18 years old, and she and her sister had been trying to protect each other in circumstances where no one else was offering protection. Vera Millwood was 40 years old. She had been born in Spain and had lived in England for many years, eventually settling in Manchester. She had 7 children and suffered from chronic abdominal illness that required repeated hospital treatment. She sold sex near the grounds of Manchester Royal Infirmary, which is where she was found on May 17, 1978, by a gardener beginning his morning work. She had been known at the hospital as a patient. She was found in a grim kind of irony on the grounds of the place where she had sought medical treatment. Josephine Whittaker was 19 years old. She worked as a clerk at the Halifax Building Society, which tells you something specific about the life she was building: steady employment, a regular schedule, a profession with prospects. On the evening of April 4th, 1979, she had visited her grandparents in Savile Park, Halifax, and was walking home across the park itself, a familiar half-mile route she had walked before. The time was not especially late, around 11:30 at night, an hour that millions of people in English cities moved through without incident every evening. She was found on the park the following morning. Barbara Leach was 20 years old, a second-year student at the University of Bradford studying social psychology. She had grown up in Kettering in Northamptonshire and had come north to study. By September 1979, she was well settled into student life, with friends and a social routine that included the pubs near the university campus. On the night of September 1st, 1979, she had been at the Manville Arms pub on Heaton Road with a group of friends. The pub was a few hundred metres from her student house on Ash Grove in the Bradford suburb of Heaton. The walk was brief and familiar. Sometime around midnight, she decided to head home, slightly after her friends, and walked out of the pub into the night. She never arrived at the house. Her body was found the following morning, concealed near some dustbins in a yard off Ash Grove, covered with a piece of cloth. Margaret Walls was 47 years old. She had been born in Dunfermline, Scotland, and had built a professional career in the civil service in West Yorkshire. She worked at the Department of Education and Science in Pudsey, which is a town on the western edge of Leeds. By the summer of 1980, she was an established professional woman who had held her position for a number of years and was known and respected by her colleagues. On the evening of August 20th, 1980, she was working late at her office, as she sometimes did when deadlines required it. She walked home through a quiet residential area of Farsley and was found the following day in the grounds of a house on New Street Lane. She had been 47 years old, which meant she had lived through the post-war period and the social changes of the 1950s and 1960s, and had arrived at a middle age defined by professional competence and ordered routine, and none of that had been enough. Jacqueline Hill was 20 years old. She was reading English literature at the University of Leeds, having come to the city from her family's home in Middlesbrough. By November 1980, she was in her second year, embedded in the academic and social life of the university, attending lectures and seminars and living in halls of residence in the Headingley area of Leeds. On the evening of November 17, 1980, she attended a seminar at the Bretton Hall Annex on Headingley Lane and afterward caught a bus toward her residence at Lupton Flats. She got off at the Arndale House bus stop, which was a short walk from her hall. She was found the following morning in a lane off Alma Road, 100 metres from where she had stepped off the bus. She was 20 years old, and she had been walking a route she knew, and it was a Monday evening, and she was the last. 13 women. It bears repeating that this number, 13, while it describes the legal outcome of the case, does not represent the full count of women Peter Sutcliffe harmed. There were women who survived attacks attributed to him, some of whom lived with the physical and psychological consequences for decades afterward, and who will appear in the investigation section of this account, because their testimony was among the most significant evidence available to a police force that, for 5 years, failed to use it as effectively as it could have been used. But the 13 murdered women are who this episode is about, each of them fully alive in a specific city, in a specific decade, with specific people who loved them and specific futures that were destroyed. Each of them the subject of an investigation that should have been faster and better than it was. Before we examine what happened to them and what followed, there is one more thing to understand about the world they were living in, and it concerns the man who was moving through it at the same time. Peter Sutcliffe, in 1975, was 28 years old. He lived with his wife Sonia in Bradford. He drove lorries for T&WH Clark's haulage yard in Shipley. He was known to his colleagues as a reliable, somewhat quiet man who did his job without complaint and socialized in a low-key way. He was known to his neighbors as a decent neighbor who kept his garden tidy and was friendly in passing. He went to the pub. He watched football. He had a wife he had courted for several years before marrying in August 1974, a woman named Sonia Surma, the daughter of Czech immigrants, who was training as a schoolteacher. His was an ordinary life in every external observable dimension. He had, earlier, been convicted in 1969 of going equipped to steal, in an incident that involved him being found in possession of a hammer. This conviction produced a fine. Nothing else. He was not a man with a violent record. He was not a man who appeared on any radar as dangerous. He was, to the world that saw him, simply someone living in Bradford and driving lorries and going home to his wife at night. This ordinariness was not a disguise in the theatrical sense. It was not a mask he chose to wear over some more visible alternative. It was genuinely how he appeared and, to a significant extent, genuinely how he lived. This is the aspect of his case that is most difficult to absorb, not the violence, which is monstrous and comprehensible as monstrousness, but the coexistence of the violence with a life that looked entirely unremarkable from the outside. It is what made him so difficult to find. It is also what made the 9 interviews so haunting, because the officers who sat across from him were looking at exactly what they saw, and what they saw gave them nothing. Let us look at what he did. There is a quality to forensic evidence that is different from everything else in a criminal investigation. Witness accounts can be incomplete or mistaken. Timelines can be reconstructed incorrectly. Theories can be wrong. But forensic evidence is what is physically there, what the body and the ground and the instruments leave behind as a record, and it does not speculate. When you look at the forensic record of the 13 murders attributed to Peter Sutcliffe, the first thing that strikes you is the consistency. The hammer, the stabbing that followed, the sexual element in the positioning of clothing, though without evidence of penetrative sexual assault in most cases, the boot impression at multiple scenes, size 7, a distinctive ribbed sole pattern that matched across the first several crimes, and established early in the inquiry that a single individual was responsible for what was otherwise an unprecedented series. The forensic record of the case begins not with Wilma McCann in October 1975, but earlier, with an attack that was only confirmed as Sutcliffe's work after his confession. Olive Smelt was 30 years old, a secretary from Halifax. On the evening of August 15, 1975, she had been for a drink with friends and was walking home, alone, along Boothtown Road. Someone came up behind her and struck her twice on the head with a blunt instrument. She fell. She was found, injured and conscious, by a passing driver who stopped and called for an ambulance. She survived, though the head injuries required extensive medical treatment. She never got a clear look at her attacker. She reported the attack and was interviewed by police. A note was taken. In the absence of a suspect or further leads, it was filed as an unsolved serious assault and essentially set aside. Olive Smelt would live for more than 5 years, not knowing who had attacked her. When Peter Sutcliffe was arrested in January 1981 and began his confession, he described the attack on Olive Smelt in specific enough detail to confirm his involvement. She was contacted. She was shown a photograph. She was asked if she recognized the man in it. She did. The specific experience of a survivor recognizing the face of the man who attacked you and understanding simultaneously that the same man had then gone on to kill 13 other women is not a thing that can be adequately described from the outside. Olive Smelt said, in subsequent accounts, that it changed how she thought about her own survival in ways she was still working through years later. Wilma McCann's death on October 30th, 1975, was the first formally recognized murder of the series that would be attributed to Peter Sutcliffe. The forensic examination conducted by pathologist Dr. Michael Green established the following. McCann had been struck twice on the back of the head with a hammer or similar blunt instrument. The blows had caused skull fracture and brain injury severe enough to be the primary cause of death. She had then been stabbed 15 times, wounds to her neck, chest, and abdomen with a sharp, narrow-bladed instrument. Her tights and underwear had been pulled down, consistent with sexual motivation, though there was no physical evidence of sexual penetration. She had died where she was found, on the grass embankment of Prince Philip playing fields, meaning she had not been moved after death. At the edge of the body's location, scene-of-crime officers found a footwear impression in the soft ground. It was made by a boot with a distinctive ribbed sole pattern, approximately a size 7. The investigation was led initially by Detective Chief Superintendent Dennis Hoban. Hoban had 25 years of experience in Leeds CID by 1975 and was known for methodical thoroughness. He studied the scene and the forensic findings and noted 2 things that he considered significant. First, the combination of hammer blows and subsequent stabbing was unusual. In his experience, killers typically used one method. The combination suggested someone with a specific, perhaps ritualized approach. Second, the positioning of McCann's clothing and the nature of the scene suggested that the killer had spent time at the scene after the killing, which indicated a level of control not consistent with panic. Hoban told his team privately that he thought this was not the first time. He was not yet certain, but the controlled nature of what he was looking at suggested practice. 3 months later, Emily Jackson was murdered, and Hoban's private assessment became a public statement. Emily Jackson was found in a yard off Roundhay Road, Leeds, on January 21, 1976. She had been struck on the back of the head with a hammer, matching the McCann blow pattern. She had then been stabbed, but not 15 times as McCann had been stabbed. She had been stabbed 52 times. The instrument was different, a sharpened screwdriver, used to make multiple deep puncture wounds to her neck, chest, abdomen, and thighs. The same size 7 ribbed sole boot impression was found at the scene. The same sexual positioning of clothing. 52 wounds. The escalation from 15 to 52 in 3 months indicated something about how the perpetrator was developing between attacks, and the fact that forensic investigators were able to distinguish the tool used, a hammer for the head, a screwdriver for the stab wounds, was significant, because it demonstrated that the killer was bringing 2 instruments to each scene, a fact that would be confirmed at scene after scene and would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of the series. Dennis Hoban convened a press conference and publicly stated what the evidence had already told him. These 2 murders were connected and appeared to be the work of the same individual. He described the killer as someone who harbored, in his words, a deep-seated hatred of women. He warned women in the Chapeltown area to be cautious. He began cross-referencing the 2 inquiry files and requested additional investigative resource. What he did not know yet, and would not know until several years of inquiry had accumulated, was that between the McCann and Jackson murders there had already been another attack. Marcella Claxton. Marcella Claxton was 20 years old, a black woman from Leeds, who had been in Roundhay Park on the night of May 9th, 1976. She was struck on the back of the head with a hammer. The blow was severe enough to cause serious injury. She fell and lost consciousness. Her attacker left her for dead. A driver passed and found her, still alive, and she was taken to hospital. She required 43 stitches for the head wound. She survived. Marcella Claxton gave police a description of her attacker and of the car he had been driving. She described a white car, possibly a Ford Cortina. She described the man as broad-shouldered with dark, curly hair and a beard. She described specific details of his face and manner. The description was recorded. What was not done with it was what should have been done with it, which was to link it to the McCann and Jackson murders, both of which had involved hammer blows to the head in the same general area of Leeds, and both of which had involved what appeared to be the same individual. The reason it was not linked in the way it should have been is a compound of 2 things. First, there was no stabbing in the Claxton attack, and investigators had begun to think of the stabbing as a defining feature of the series. Second, and more difficult to state directly but important to state, Marcella Claxton was a black woman, and the emerging series had been mentally categorized around white victims. This was not a conscious policy, not a decision that was made and recorded. It was the kind of institutional assumption that operates below the level of policy, shaping what is connected to what and what is taken seriously and what is filed. Its consequences were that Marcella Claxton's account was not integrated into the series investigation in the way that it should have been, and the detailed description she had given of a bearded, dark-haired, broad-shouldered man in a white car was not circulated as the most current portrait of the suspect. Irene Richardson was killed in Roundhay Park on February 5th, 1977, approximately 9 months after Marcella Claxton had been attacked in the same park. The forensic details confirmed the series: hammer blows to the head, subsequent stabbing, the same boot impression. Richardson had her throat cut in addition to stab wounds to the abdomen. She had died from the head injuries in combination with the throat wound. After Irene Richardson, the inquiry was formally constituted as a major homicide series. A permanent incident room was established. Additional detectives were assigned. Dennis Hoban briefed the Home Office. He continued to work on the theory that the killer was a local man, probably known in the pub culture of North Leeds, who had good knowledge of the specific streets and parks he was using. He was probably right. Patricia Atkinson was found dead in her flat at 9 Oak Avenue, Bradford, on April 23, 1977. This was the first murder in Bradford, and it significantly expanded the geographic scope of the inquiry. To kill in a victim's own flat required either that the victim had invited the killer in, which was consistent with a client relationship, or that he had gained entry by deception. The Bradford City Police, who initially handled the scene before the cross-force coordination was established, found 4 hammer blows to the head, stab wounds consistent with a screwdriver, and the size 7 boot impression, this time on the victim's own thigh, pressed there after she had fallen, a detail that pathologist Dr. David G. noted as indicating that the perpetrator had stood over the body after the attack. The move to Bradford meant the killer was not confined to a single neighbourhood. He was mobile. This complicated the investigation. The assumption of a hyper-local suspect had to be revised upward to someone who knew multiple cities and travelled between them, which meant, practically, that he drove. He had a car or a van. He used it confidently. Jane MacDonald was found on June 27, 1977, in the back garden of a house in Reginald Street, Chapeltown. The forensic findings: 2 hammer blows to the head, stab wounds to the back and chest, the same boot impression. She was 16 years old, and the pattern of her wounds was identical to the pattern of wounds on the women who had died before her. The media response to Jane MacDonald's murder was, as already described, qualitatively different from what had come before. But there is something else about Jane MacDonald's case that is important forensically: the specific location. She was found in the garden of a house in a residential street, in the middle of a district that police and press were associating with street prostitution. The implication that her presence there was in some way anomalous, when in fact the area was a residential neighbourhood that contained thousands of people who lived there normally and had no connection to sex work, was another of the framing errors that shaped public understanding of the case. In the aftermath of Jane MacDonald's murder, 2 women survived attacks that provided investigators with some of the best evidence they would receive during the entire inquiry. Maureen Long was attacked in Bradford on July 10, 1977. She survived despite serious head injuries. She had been out at a pub and had been offered a lift by a man in a white car with a sunroof. The car had engine trouble, making a distinctive sound at certain speeds. The man had driven her to waste ground and attacked her. She was found by a passerby and taken to hospital. She gave investigators a detailed description of the car and a general description of the driver. Tall, dark, curly hair, a beard. She was certain about the car's features, including the sunroof and the engine sound. This information was logged. The white car with the distinctive engine noise would come up again. Jean Jordan was killed on or around October 1, 1977, in the Moss Side area of Manchester. She had been working in the area when a man in a car approached her. She got into the car. He drove her to allotment gardens on Clifford Street, where he attacked her with a hammer. The hammer blows did not immediately kill her. He continued the attack and eventually killed her. Jean Jordan's body was not found for 9 days. On October 10th, a man walking on the allotment found her. The condition of the body after 9 days' exposure made the forensic examination more difficult, but the pathological findings still confirmed the series hallmarks: hammer blows to the head, stab wounds from a screwdriver, sexual motivation in the positioning of clothing. On October 10th, searchers also found her handbag, and in the handbag, in a separate internal pocket, was a £5 note. The note was new. Its serial number was AW51121565. Investigators recognized immediately the potential significance. A new note could be traced to a specific banking batch with considerable precision. The note was sent for forensic examination and then for financial tracing. What the tracing eventually established was this: the note was from a batch issued by the Midland Bank in Shipley, a town that is now part of Bradford. The bank had distributed notes from this batch to a number of local firms as wages payments. The firms were identified and the payroll records for the relevant period were examined. The note, based on serial number, had gone out to one of approximately 30 companies in the Shipley and Bradford area. One of those companies was T&W.H. Clark's haulage yard. Peter Sutcliffe worked at T&W.H. Clark's haulage yard as a lorry driver. This was the closest the inquiry came to Peter Sutcliffe before his arrest, and it is the nearest thing to a definitive moment of could have been that the case contains. The note placed a payment in the hand of a man who worked at one of those 30 firms. The list of employees at those firms who could have received a note from that batch ran to approximately 8,000 people. Sutcliffe was one of 8,000. but he was specifically one of 8,000, and the inquiry assigned to this specific strand of the investigation knew it. But let us complete the sequence of crimes before we turn to the investigation. Peter Sutcliffe returned to Jean Jordan's body. After the killing on October 1st, and before the body was found on October 10th, he came back. He came back because he knew about the £5 note. He had given it to John Jordan and then realized, sometime in the following days, that new notes could be traced and that this one could lead back to him. He returned to the allotments to find and destroy it. He searched the body and could not locate the note because it was in an internal pocket of her handbag, not immediately accessible. In his frustration, he attempted to decapitate the body. He was disturbed either by sounds or by the approach of someone in the area before he could complete this, and he fled. The attempt at decapitation was noted by forensic pathologists as an anomaly, completely different from the stab wounds that had characterized the series. What none of them could know at the time was that it was the result of a panicked attempt at evidence destruction. The note was not found that night. The note was found the following morning by the searchers in the pocket where Sutcliffe had not looked. He had gone back to destroy it. He had failed. The note survived. The note was traced. And Peter Sutcliffe was brought in for interview. He was not arrested. He was interviewed and released. This is the act break of the entire investigation, the moment when the course of the case hung on a decision, and the decision went wrong. It did not go wrong because any individual officer was incompetent or corrupt. It went wrong because the inquiry had 8,000 names and insufficient tools to cross-reference them, and because Sutcliffe's wife provided an alibi that could not be immediately disproved, and because there was no computer system that could have found, at that moment, the thread connecting all of his appearances in the inquiry files to each other. He was interviewed about the note and released. Within 2 months, 2 more women were dead. Yvonne Pearson was killed on January 21st, 1978. The attack took place on waste ground near Arthington Street in Bradford. She was struck repeatedly with a hammer, a greater number of blows than had been used in previous attacks, a detail that pathologist Dr. G noted. Her body was stuffed under the frame of an old abandoned sofa on the waste ground, and the concealment was effective. She was not found for more than 3 months, until April 26, 1978. When the scene was examined, investigators found a copy of the Daily Mirror dated February 21, 1978, tucked beneath her body. Yvonne Pearson had been dead since January 21st. The newspaper was dated a month after her death. It had been placed there after the killing, which meant that whoever had killed her had returned to the scene at some point in the weeks following her death, had sat or crouched beside her concealed body, and had placed a newspaper under her. Peter Sutcliffe, in his confession, confirmed this. He had gone back. The reason, as he gave it, was a kind of dark curiosity about whether the body had been found yet. He had placed the newspaper either as a marker or as a gesture whose meaning is not clear, and probably should not be searched for too carefully. Helen Ritker was killed on January 31st, 1978, 10 days after Yvonne Pearson. She had been working near the Great Northern Street timber yard in Huddersfield with her twin sister Rita when a man in a car stopped and offered her a fare. The man drove to the timber yard itself, which was secluded enough for the purposes he had in mind. Helen Ritker was struck 5 times on the head with a hammer. She was then stabbed 5 times. The post-mortem, conducted by Dr. G, found that she had likely died quickly from the head injuries, which provided a specific kind of grim information. She may not have had time to understand what was happening to her before she was gone. Rita Ritker waited at their agreed meeting point. Her twin had told her she would be back by a certain time. She waited past that time. She continued waiting. She was still there when another person came and told her that police had been called to an incident nearby. Rita Ritker, who was also 18 years old and who had designed the safety system that was supposed to protect them both, now understood that it had not been enough. Vera Millwood was found on May 17, 1978, on the grounds of Manchester Royal Infirmary. She was 40 years old and had been a patient at the hospital repeatedly for her abdominal condition. She sold sex in the area around the hospital, partly because the location brought clients, and partly because her health meant she could not always travel far. She was found by a hospital gardener beginning his morning work, lying near the nurse's home. 3 hammer blows to the head, multiple stab wounds to the abdomen with a screwdriver. The same boot impression at the scene, now confirmed across 7 murders. At this point, 5 years before the arrest, the investigation had the following established facts: a single perpetrator responsible for the connected deaths of McCann, Jackson, Richardson, Atkinson, MacDonald, Jordan, Pearson, Ritka, and Millwood. A perpetrator who used a hammer and a screwdriver-type instrument, a perpetrator who left a distinctive boot impression, a perpetrator who was mobile, operating in Leeds, Bradford, Huddersfield, and Manchester. A perpetrator who had received a traceable £5 note as wages from one of 30 companies in the Bradford area. A perpetrator whose victims included women selling sex, and a 16-year-old walking home, and a woman visiting her grandparents. And a description, from survivors Marcella Claxton and Maureen Long, of a broad-shouldered man with dark, curly hair and a beard. They had more information than they could manage. What they did not have was what was about to arrive in an envelope postmarked Sunderland, and what it was going to do to the investigation. But we will get to that in the third movement. First, 4 more murders. Josephine Whittaker was found on April 5, 1979, on Savile Park in Halifax. She was 19 years old. The forensic examination established that she had been struck on the head with a hammer and then stabbed repeatedly with 2 instruments, a Phillips head screwdriver and another pointed tool. Dr. G counted 31 stab wounds. She had died from the combination of head injury and blood loss. The forensic evidence from Josephine Whittaker's death added something important to the picture. Saliva samples recovered from the body were typed, using the forensic technology then available, as coming from someone of blood group B. This analysis was conducted, and the result logged. Investigators noted it alongside the other forensic evidence. The blood group B finding would later be misused by the investigation in a way that cost additional lives, because it would be combined with biological evidence from a hoax tape that came from a different source entirely. But at this point, it was simply evidence. Blood group B, which corresponded to approximately 9% of the male population. What the investigators on the Whittaker case noted, correctly, was that she had no connection to sex work and had simply been walking home across a public park. This made 4 of the 10 victims so far with no such connection. McCann had one that was disputed and occasional, Jackson had one that was concealed and financially motivated, but Jane MacDonald and Josephine Whittaker had none at all. The profile of who the killer was targeting was clearly not limited to sex workers. It had never been so limited. But the framing of the case, both in press coverage and in some of the internal documents of the inquiry, still carried the residue of the earlier framing. Barbara Leach was found on September 2, 1979, behind a stone wall near the dustbins at the back of a house on Ash Grove in Bradford's Heaton area. She was 20 years old. She had been struck on the head and stabbed 8 times with a screwdriver. She was covered with a piece of cloth. The cloth was later identified as an item that had come from the general area, not brought by the killer. Her body had been moved a short distance from the initial attack site to the hiding spot behind the wall. Barbara Leach's murder came 48 days after Peter Sutcliffe had been interviewed again by the Ripper inquiry team in July 1979. This was his 5th formal interview in connection with the case. He had been interviewed and released. And then, 48 days later, Barbara Leach was dead. Margaret Walls was found on August 21, 1980, in the grounds of a house at New Street Lane in Farsley, near Leeds. She was 47 years old. The forensic details of her death differed from the previous cases in one significant way. She had been strangled. She had also received hammer blows to the head, but the primary cause of death was strangulation, and there were no stab wounds. Her clothing showed the same disturbed positioning consistent with the other cases, but the specific methodology was different. The absence of stabbing created a genuine problem for the investigation's classification of her case. Some investigators were initially uncertain whether her death should be attributed to the same series. The hammer blows connected it. The positioning of clothing connected it. But the strangulation, combined with the absence of stabbing, created doubt. Peter Sutcliffe, in his confession, confirmed that he had killed Marguerite Walls. He had used strangulation because, he said, the circumstances of the location and his approach to her had not given him a clear opportunity to use a hammer first. The strangulation was an adaptation, not a departure. The classification debate cost the inquiry time it did not have. Jacqueline Hill was found on November 18, 1980, in a lane off Alma Road in the Headingley area of Leeds. She was 20 years old, a student at the University of Leeds. She had been struck on the head with a hammer and then stabbed 13 times. One of the stab wounds had been driven into her left eye socket. The specificity of this wound, its deliberate and precise nature, was noted by the pathologist as different from the earlier cases, where stab wounds had been distributed across the torso. It indicated a kind of targeted deliberateness that is difficult to assess in terms of what it tells us about the perpetrator's state of mind at that point in the series, but it was noted by everyone who examined the case. She had been found by a man walking his dog in the early morning. She had been attacked fewer than 100 meters from the bus stop, where she had alighted from the bus the previous evening. The entire span of her exposure, from the bus stop to the attack site, was less than 2 minutes of walking. 2 minutes, less than that. The public response to Jacqueline Hill's murder was, as I have noted, intense in a way that had no precedent in the 5 years of the inquiry. At a police press conference shortly after the discovery of her body, Assistant Chief Constable Jim Hobson urged women to stay off the streets of Leeds at night. He framed this as practical advice. It was received by many of the women it was addressed to as evidence of how thoroughly the institution had failed. "You are telling us to stay home," was the response. "You have been looking for this man for 5 years. He has killed 13 women. And your advice is that we should stay home." The detective heading the inquiry at this point, George Oldfield, was a man who had become personally consumed by the case in a way that the case was about to exploit with devastating effect. The Yorkshire Ripper inquiry became, at its height, one of the largest police investigations in British criminal history. By the time it concluded in January 1981, it had employed more than 300 detectives full-time, with thousands more contributing to specific lines of inquiry. It had generated more than 250,000 names on index cards, managed in a dedicated incident room that occupied most of a floor of the West Yorkshire Police Headquarters in Wakefield. It had traced more than 5 million £5 notes. It had logged more than 30 million vehicle registrations. It had conducted more than 250,000 interviews. It had consumed, in various estimates, somewhere between 4 and 8 million person-hours of police work. It did not catch Peter Sutcliffe. A traffic stop caught Peter Sutcliffe. And once you understand the specific ways the inquiry failed, you cannot go back to treating that as a minor irony. It is the central fact of the case. To understand how an inquiry of this scale and resource failed to identify a man who appeared in its files 9 times, you need to understand how major police investigations worked in Britain in the 1970s. The management of a major inquiry in this period was a paper-based process. Information came in, was written on forms, and was indexed on cards. Each card represented a name, a vehicle, a location, or a piece of evidence. The cards were held in the incident room and were retrievable by the index categories assigned to them when they were created. To cross-reference 2 different categories of information, to ask, for example, what names appear both in the vehicle registration checks and in the £5 note inquiry, a human officer had to go through both sets of cards manually and compare them. In an inquiry that had generated hundreds of thousands of index cards across multiple strand inquiries, manual cross-referencing was practically impossible. You could ask a specific question and get the answer if you knew how to ask it. But asking questions that connected multiple strands of information required a kind of overview that the paper system structurally prevented. This is not a metaphor or a vague structural critique. It is the specific mechanical reason that Peter Sutcliffe, who appeared across multiple different inquiry strands across 4 years, was not flagged as a high-priority suspect. No individual officer had sight of all the appearances. No system could aggregate them. The information was there. The connection was there. But the tools to find the connection within the mountain of paper did not exist. When Holmes, the Home Office Large Major Inquiry System, was developed in response to the inquiry's failures and deployed in British policing from 1986, the first thing it was designed to do was exactly this: to cross-reference information from different inquiry strands in real time, so that a name appearing in the vehicle checks and the £5 note inquiry and the interview records and the tyre track analysis would automatically generate a flag. Had Holmes existed in 1977, Peter Sutcliffe would almost certainly have been identified within months of Wilma McCann's death. He was in the system. He just could not be found by the system as it existed. Dennis Hoban understood some of these limitations, but was not positioned to resolve them. He was working with the tools available. He focused his early effort on the geographic and behavioral profile of the killer, which was his strong suit as an investigator. He believed correctly that the killer was a local man with deep knowledge of the specific areas being used. He believed correctly that the killer drove. He was developing, through the accumulation of crime scene and forensic evidence, a picture of someone who was controlled, methodical, and not acting in any way that was visible to the people around him. He was also attending to the evidence from survivors. Olive Smelt's report of being attacked from behind, Marcella Claxton's description of a bearded man with dark hair in a white car. In March 1978, Dennis Hoban died. He was 53 years old and had been ill for some time with a condition unrelated to the investigation. The loss of the officer who had built the inquiry from its foundation was significant, not because Hoban was irreplaceable in any absolute sense, but because the institutional knowledge of how the inquiry had developed and what it had prioritized was held, in large part, in his head. And when he died, it was not fully documented in a way that his successors could readily access. Command of the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry passed through a period of transition before Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield assumed personal direction of it in 1977 and maintained that direction through to 1980. Oldfield was, by the accounts of colleagues who worked with him, a deeply committed investigator with a powerful drive to succeed. He was also a man who had, over the course of the inquiry, developed a personal investment in the case that would eventually produce the most consequential misjudgment in its history. Before we get to that misjudgment, it is worth examining the state of the investigation in the period between the end of 1977 and the middle of 1978, because this was the period when the inquiry was probably closest to the truth before the hoax intervened. The £5 note inquiry was, in late 1977 and early 1978, the most concrete forensic lead the investigation had. The tracing work was painstaking. Taking the note's serial number through the banking chain to the issuing branch, identifying the companies that had received notes from that batch as wages, obtaining payroll records from those companies, producing lists of employees who could have received a note from the batch in the relevant wage packets. The list of companies included T and W. H. Clark's haulage yard in Shipley. The list of employees potentially connected to the note batch ran to approximately 8,000 people across all of the identified firms. Peter Sutcliffe was among those 8,000. In November 1977, 2 detectives visited him at his home on Garden Lane in Bradford. They explained the nature of the inquiry. He was cooperative and calm. He said he had been at home on the nights of the relevant murders. His wife Sonia confirmed this. The interviewers noted that he had a beard and dark curly hair, which matched the general descriptions from survivors, but so did a significant proportion of working-age men in Bradford in 1977. They also noted his job as a lorry driver, which was consistent with the mobility the series suggested. But there was nothing in the interview that gave them grounds to hold him, and without grounds to hold him, they could not compel him to provide alibi verification beyond his wife's word. He was logged as a possible suspect, uneliminated, and the file moved to the general suspect pool, which by this point already contained several hundred names. In the paper-based system of the inquiry, being in the general suspect pool without specific elevation was effectively the same as being in no particular pool at all. The tire track evidence was a separate thread. A number of crime scenes near which vehicle tracks had been preserved and photographed had produced impressions matching tires available on certain vehicle types in the relevant years. Cross-referencing vehicle registration records against those tire types had produced a long list of vehicles and their registered owners. Sutcliffe's car appeared on this list. He was interviewed in connection with it, separately from the £5 note inquiry in 1978. The two appearances, the note interview and the tire track interview, were not connected in the paper system as easily as they should have been. They sat in different inquiry strand files. In the summer of 1978, the letters arrived. Actually, the first letter had already arrived. In March 1978, addressed to George Oldfield, it was received at West Yorkshire Police Headquarters. The second arrived in July 1978. Both were postmarked Sunderland. Both purported to be from the Yorkshire Ripper. Both referred to aspects of the murders in ways that some investigators believed indicated inside knowledge, though the specific details cited were not uniformly agreed to be information only the killer could know. One analyst noted that several of the claimed insider details were consistent with publicly available information from press coverage. Another argued that one specific detail about the third letter could not have been drawn from press coverage alone. The division within the inquiry about the letter's authenticity was real and significant, and it was never fully resolved internally before the tape arrived. In June 1979, a cassette tape was received at West Yorkshire Police Headquarters. Like the letters, it was postmarked Sunderland. The envelope was addressed to George Oldfield personally. On the tape, a man spoke for approximately 3 minutes. He used a strong Wearside accent, the accent of the Sunderland area in the northeast of England, more than 100 miles from West Yorkshire. He addressed Oldfield by name. He said, "I'm Jack. I see you are still having no luck catching me. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started." The tape was sent to phonetics experts at Leeds University for analysis. Their conclusion, which was given with considerable confidence, was that the speaker was genuinely from the Wearside region of the northeast. The accent was authentic and specific in ways that would be very difficult to fake. Not just the broad characteristics of a northeastern accent, but the specific phonetic features of Wearside, distinguishable from Tyneside or Teesside by someone with expert ears. The man on the tape was from Sunderland. George Oldfield became convinced the tape was genuine. He played it at a press conference on June 26, 1979. He was visibly emotional at the press conference, to the extent that his reaction became itself a part of the public record of the case. He said he was certain this was the voice of the Yorkshire Ripper. The tape was broadcast on Yorkshire television and on BBC regional radio. Police set up a dedicated telephone line, asking members of the public to call in if they recognized the voice. They received thousands of calls. The tape was played in football grounds and pub jukeboxes across the north of England. Shop workers were given copies to be played on the premises. It was one of the most extensive public appeals in British criminal history to that point, and it was built on a premise that was completely false. The voice on the tape was that of John Samuel Humble, who was at that time a 30-year-old man living in Sunderland. He had no connection to the murders. He had sent the letters and made the tape for reasons that have never been fully explained, and that Humble himself, when interviewed after his identification 26 years later, did not explain satisfactorily. He had a general awareness of the case from press coverage, and had used that coverage, combined with a natural facility for writing that gave the letters a credible surface, to construct communications that the police were disposed to take seriously. It is important to be specific about the consequences of the tape and why they were so severe. Before the tape's release, the description profile of the Ripper suspect was built from survivor accounts. A broad, dark, bearded man in a white car, probably from West Yorkshire or Greater Manchester based on his knowledge of the areas. This was consistent with Peter Sutcliffe. After the tape's release, the official public position of the inquiry was that the Ripper spoke with a Wearside accent. This was not consistent with Peter Sutcliffe, whose accent was Bradford, West Yorkshire to any trained or untrained ear. Peter Sutcliffe was still in the inquiry's files. He had not been eliminated from the £5 note inquiry. He had been flagged in the tyre track inquiry. But after June 1979, when the inquiry's public profile was oriented around the Sunderland voice, the practical consequence within the investigation was that men with Yorkshire accents, men like Sutcliffe, were being set aside in favour of men who might sound like the voice on the tape. After Josephine Whittaker's murder in April 1979, 2 months before the tape was publicly released, but after the letters had already influenced the investigation internally, Sutcliffe had been a person of interest. Detectives working the Whittaker case had actually noted his name in the inquiry system and queued him for follow-up interview. That follow-up interview, the 5th, took place in July 1979, after the tape's public release. The interviewing officers noted that his accent was West Yorkshire, not Wearside. This observation, which should have been irrelevant, was treated as mitigating. In November 1979, a further cross-referencing exercise produced Sutcliffe's name again. He was interviewed for the 6th time. In July 1980, a systematic review of recurring names in the files, an attempt to address the investigation's inability to aggregate information by doing so manually and laboriously, produced his name for the 7th and 8th times. He was visited, interviewed, and released on each occasion. He was cooperative on each occasion. He answered questions well. He presented no behavioural flag that officers could articulate. Now, George Oldfield. George Oldfield was a man of considerable personal dedication who had given the better part of his professional life to the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry by 1979. The tape, with its direct personal address, had engaged something in him that was not purely professional. He was known, within the inquiry and outside it, to be deeply invested in the idea that the man on the tape was real. He spoke about catching him in terms that colleagues described as personal, as though the relationship between Oldfield and the Ripper had taken on a dimension that went beyond the professional and the institutional. He was not a man who was performing this investment. It was genuine, and the tape had become its focus. In October 1979, Oldfield suffered a heart attack. He was 55 years old. He recovered sufficiently to remain nominally involved in the inquiry, but his active direction of it effectively ended with the heart attack. The investigation continued in something of an organizational drift through 1980, with different officers taking leads on different aspects without the coherent central direction that Holborn had originally provided. By 1980, the inquiry had accumulated so much information that its own weight had become one of its problems. The incident room contained more than 250,000 index cards. The number of named suspects and persons of interest ran into the tens of thousands. The tyre track inquiry had produced thousands of vehicle links. The £5 note inquiry remained technically open, but had effectively stalled at the level of a pool too large to eliminate systematically. The Wearside Jack investigation continued in parallel, with officers travelling to Sunderland to follow up leads from the voice recognition phone line. 3 more women died in this organisational confusion. Barbara Leach died in September 1979. Marguerite Walls died in August 1980. And then Jacqueline Hill died in November 1980, and the inquiry entered its last phase. Following Jacqueline Hill's murder, the West Yorkshire Force brought in a team for a systematic review of the major inquiry files. This review was meant to address the accumulated failure to cross-reference information. It was a manual attempt to do what Holmes would later do automatically, to go through the 250,000 index cards and look for names that appeared multiple times in multiple different inquiry contexts. The review produced a short list of names. Peter Sutcliffe was on it. He was among the names that had appeared most frequently across multiple inquiry strands, a fact that was recognized in the review as potentially significant. He was brought in for his 9th formal interview in November 1980. The interview was conducted at his home. His wife was present for parts of it. He was asked about his movements on the night of Jacqueline Hill's murder. His answer was not an established alibi. He said he had been at home, that his wife could confirm this. His wife said she could confirm it. The investigators noted the unverified alibi and could not disprove it. They left. 6 weeks later, Peter Sutcliffe was in Sheffield. The arrest itself, on the night of January 2nd, 1981, had a quality of chance about it that was genuinely difficult to absorb in the aftermath. Sutcliffe had been in Sheffield's red light district with false plates, which was unusual behaviour for him. His use of false plates was not explained satisfactorily in subsequent interviews, though one explanation offered was that he had taken the plates from another vehicle deliberately as a precaution against police checks, which would indicate a level of operational caution that had developed over the years of killing. He was with a sex worker, Olivia Ravers. He was stopped on what was, from the officer's perspective, a straightforward traffic inquiry. His calm during the stop, which he maintained throughout the initial booking and into the first hours of inquiry at the station, was of a piece with the calm that 9 separate sets of interviewing officers had noted across 4 years. He did not become agitated. He did not make mistakes in his initial account. He was polite, responsive, and apparently untroubled. What troubled him, in the night between the arrest and the discovery of the weapons, was something he could conceal because he was, by this point, very good at concealing it. When Sergeant Ring came back to Melbourne Avenue on the morning of January 3rd and found the hammer and knife, the nature of the inquiry changed. Sutcliffe was told that the weapons had been found and that he would need to explain them. His explanation, that he had put them there because he did not want to be found with them, was accurate as far as it went. It did not go far enough. He was held. The detective cross-reference that afternoon was the moment that 5 years of failed cross-referencing finally produced its result. A detective, doing a routine check of Sutcliffe's name against the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry indexes, found 9 entries. He pulled the files. He read through them. He made the call to the inquiry team. The senior officers who arrived at Sheffield were men who had spent years on this case. They were looking at an index card with a familiar name that they had looked at before in the context of the inquiry, and had not been able to make the connection that now, with the hammer and the knife found in the bushes and the false plates and the Sheffield location, suddenly seemed, in retrospect, obvious. The obvious thing, in retrospect, is always only obvious in retrospect. But the 9 interviews, taken together and laid out in sequence, produced a cumulative document of missed connection that was nearly unbearable to read. Each individual interview had produced a result of insufficient grounds to proceed. In aggregate, they told a different story, a story that the paper system could not read because it could not aggregate what it could not connect. On January 4th, Sutcliffe was formally informed that he was a suspect in the Yorkshire Ripper murders. He asked to see his solicitor. The solicitor arrived. After consultation, Sutcliffe said he would speak. He spoke for 2 days. And as he spoke, each of the 9 previous interviews in which he had been calm and cooperative and released became a different kind of document. Not evidence of his innocence, which they had been treated as, evidence of how good he was at this, which they had always been. He described Jean Jordan's murder and his return to the scene to find the £5 note. He described Yvonne Pearson and the newspaper. He described Helen Ritker in the timber yard. He described Josephine Whittaker on Savile Park. He described Barbara Leach behind the wall on Ash Grove. He described Marguerite Walls in Farsley. He described Jacqueline Hill at the bus stop and the lane off Alma Road and what happened in the 100 metres between them. And then he told them about the voice. The story had a specific, verifiable surface, which was part of what made it difficult to dismiss entirely and part of what made the detectives most suspicious of it. Peter Sutcliffe had worked as a gravedigger at Bingley Cemetery in the late 1960s. This was documented. Employment records confirmed it. Colleagues from that period, when later contacted, remembered him as quiet and unremarkable, a man who showed up and did the work, and gave nobody any cause to remember him for any particular reason. He had been there, he had dug graves, he had worked among the headstones. That part of the account was real. The grave in question belonged to a man named Bronislaw Zapolski. Zapolski was a Polish immigrant who had settled in the Bradford area and died and been buried in Bingley in the years before Sutcliffe worked there. The grave had a headstone. There was nothing about it that distinguished it from the hundreds of other graves in the cemetery. It was an ordinary grave, of a man most people in the area had never heard of, marked with a stone in the way ordinary graves are marked. What Sutcliffe told the detectives was this. While he was working near the Zapolski grave, he had heard a voice. The voice came from the ground, from the direction of the grave. He said it was not a thought that felt like a voice, and it was not something he had imagined. It was external. It came from outside him, and it addressed him directly, and it gave him a mission. He told them the mission was to rid the streets of prostitutes. Those were his words. Rid the streets of prostitutes. The voice, which he understood to be the voice of God, had identified the women as a pollution, as something that needed to be cleared away. He was the instrument for this. He had been chosen, and the grave of Bronislaw Zapolski in Bingley Cemetery was where the choosing had happened. He told this to the detectives in a tone that officers present later described as unnervingly ordinary. Not distressed, not exalted, not performed in any way they could identify. He described the divine instruction with the same matter-of-fact register he had used to describe the murders themselves, and the murders themselves he had described the way a man describes routes he has driven and deliveries he has made. He told them about the voice in Bingley, and he told them about Wilma McCann on Scott Hall Road, and he told them about Jean Jordan and the £5 note, and the tone across all of it was the same. He said at one point in the confession, "I was just cleaning up the streets." He said it without any apparent sense that it required further justification, the way a man might explain that he had been doing what he was supposed to do, and the matter did not seem to him to require elaboration. Cleaning up the streets. That was the translation of the divine mission into practical language, and it was the phrase that stayed with the detectives who heard it in a way that few things in their professional lives had stayed with them before. The subsequent psychiatric assessments conducted by all 4 forensic psychiatrists took the graveyard account seriously as a clinical matter, which is appropriate because they were clinicians and their job was to assess the clinical reality of what he described. Auditory hallucinations of authoritative external voices issuing commands are a documented and well-understood feature of paranoid schizophrenia. The account was not, on its face, inconsistent with a genuine psychotic experience. All 4 psychiatrists noted this, and all 4 included it in their analysis. The diagnosis they reached, paranoid schizophrenia, was in part built on this account. But the detectives were not clinicians, and what they could see from where they sat was not a clinical question, but a sequencing question. The sequence was this: 9 interviews, 4 years, hundreds of questions about the murders, about motivations, about what kind of person might do this, asked in various forms and from various angles across 9 separate occasions. In none of those 9 occasions had Peter Sutcliffe mentioned a cemetery in Bingley. In none of them had he mentioned Bronislaw Zapolski. In none of them had he mentioned a voice, or a mission, or divine instruction, or cleaning up the streets, or anything that pointed in any direction toward the account that arrived, complete and consistent, 2 days after his arrest. The completeness was part of what troubled them. It was not partial or tentative. He did not offer the account as something he was uncertain about or reluctant to put into words. He offered it fully formed, with the specific details in place, the specific grave, the specific name, the specific phrasing of the mission, and he delivered it with the same controlled consistency he had shown across all 9 prior interviews. That controlled consistency, across 4 years of contact with police, was not the profile of a man who was substantially impaired. And the fact that the divine explanation for that controlled consistency had appeared only once he was in custody and had access to legal advice was not a coincidence the detectives were prepared to treat as a coincidence. The divine mission narrative, the cemetery in Bingley, the gravestone of the Polish man named Bronislaw Zapolski, the voice of God instructing him to cleanse the streets. Senior detectives reviewing the confession were immediately, uniformly skeptical. Not because mental illness is implausible, but because the divine mission narrative had been entirely absent from 9 separate police interviews and had appeared, apparently fully formed, only after arrest and legal consultation. And because the behavior it was supposed to explain, the careful preparation, the return to scenes to destroy evidence, the consistent maintenance of normal life across years and hundreds of hours of police contact, was not the behavior the narrative explained. Someone acting on an uncontrolled religious compulsion did not carefully go back to retrieve a traceable banknote. Someone acting on a genuine delusional command did not, over 9 interviews, calmly give exactly the answers that produced his release. The skepticism of the detectives became the skepticism of the prosecution. But that is a matter for the 4th movement. Peter Sutcliffe was charged on January 5th and 6th, 1981, with 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was remanded in custody pending committal proceedings. At his first court appearance, in Dewsbury Magistrates' Court, the crowd outside was large enough to require a police cordon. The inquiry that had consumed the resources and the attention of West Yorkshire for 5 years and 3 months was now moving into its final institutional stage. The committal proceedings established that there was sufficient evidence to send the case to trial at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey in London. The decision to try the case in London rather than in Yorkshire was made partly for logistical reasons and partly because of concerns that the level of local public feeling about the case made a fair jury difficult to guarantee in West Yorkshire. The case was transferred south. The trial date was set for May 1981. In the months between the arrest and the trial, a legal and psychiatric process was taking place that would define the shape of the trial itself, and that has been debated ever since. 4 consultant psychiatrists examined Peter Sutcliffe in extended sessions. 2 were instructed by the prosecution, 2 by the defense. Their access to him was thorough. They interviewed him multiple times, reviewed his confession and the case files, examined his mental state across a range of criteria, and applied the diagnostic frameworks of British forensic psychiatry to what they found. All 4 reached the same diagnosis. Peter Sutcliffe suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. The diagnosis was not casual or rushed. Paranoid schizophrenia is a specific condition characterized by persistent and systematized delusions, often of a grandiose or persecutory kind, combined with hallucinations, typically auditory, that the sufferer experiences as external voices distinct from their own thoughts. The condition was, in 1981, well understood in its clinical presentation, and what all 4 psychiatrists found in Sutcliffe was consistent with the description: the persistent delusional belief in a divine mission, the auditory hallucination in the form of the voice from the graveyard, the systematized nature of the belief as it had developed over many years. Where the 4 psychiatrists differed was on the specific legal question of whether the schizophrenia met the threshold of the Homicide Act, 1957, for diminished responsibility. The 1957 Act provided that a person who killed while suffering from an abnormality of mind arising from disease or inherent cause, where that abnormality substantially impaired their mental responsibility for the killing, was guilty not of murder, but of manslaughter. The word substantially was the operative legal term. 2 of the 4 psychiatrists were prepared to say that Sutcliffe's paranoid schizophrenia had substantially impaired his responsibility at the time of the killings. 2 were more cautious on this specific point, while still agreeing on the diagnosis. On this basis, Sutcliffe's legal team, led by James Chadwin QC, proposed to the prosecution that Sutcliffe should enter guilty pleas to 13 counts of manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility, rather than to murder. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Michael Havers QC. Havers reviewed the psychiatric evidence and consulted with his legal team. In a decision that was unusual and remains controversial, he initially agreed to accept the manslaughter plea, subject to judicial approval. The judge was the Honourable Mr. Justice Boreham. He reviewed the proposal at a preliminary hearing and declined to accept it. He told counsel that the question of whether the threshold of diminished responsibility had been met was precisely the kind of question that Parliament had assigned to juries, and that it was not appropriate for it to be resolved by agreement between counsel without the scrutiny of a jury verdict. Guilty manslaughter pleas were refused. The trial would proceed on the full murder charges. This decision was significant and contested. The 4 forensic psychiatrists, who were the people most qualified to assess Sutcliffe's mental state, had all diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. The legal debate about whether that diagnosis satisfied the legal test for diminished responsibility was a question on which reasonable people could differ, but it was a question that belonged to experts in mental illness at least as much as it belonged to a jury. The decision to submit it to jury verdict, rather than to expert resolution, sent the case in a direction that the psychiatric evidence had not pointed toward. The trial opened on May 5, 1981, at the Old Bailey. The courtroom was crowded, as it had been for every significant criminal trial of that decade, with journalists and court artists and observers from the press and the legal profession and the interested public. The families of some of the victims were present. The families of others were not, for reasons that were their own. The prosecution case was, in its formal structure, straightforward. Peter Sutcliffe had confessed to 13 murders. The confession contained verifiable details that matched the forensic record of each crime. The forensic evidence, including the boot impressions, the tool mark evidence from the weapons recovered at the arrest and from the crime scenes, and the biological evidence, including hair and fibers, was comprehensive and consistent. The eyewitness evidence from the surviving victims, including Marcella Claxton and Marilyn Moore and Olive Smelt, was presented in terms that confirmed the pattern of the offences. Sir Michael Havers structured the prosecution case around these 3 pillars: the confession, the forensic evidence, and the survivor testimony. He argued that Sutcliffe had demonstrated, across all 13 murders, a capacity for planning, deliberation, and evasion that was inconsistent with the kind of psychotic impairment the defense was claiming. He walked the jury through the specific details of each murder: the preparation of weapons, the selection of locations, the approach to and departure from scenes, the return to Jen Jordan's body to retrieve a traceable note, the concealment of Yvonne Pearson's body, and the subsequent return to place a newspaper there. Each of these actions, Havers argued, demonstrated not a man acting under the compulsion of an uncontrolled delusion, but a man making deliberate, calculated choices. He particularly emphasized the 9 interviews. Peter Sutcliffe had sat across from police officers 9 separate times over 4 years and had successfully presented himself as a cooperative and ordinary man with no connection to the crimes. This was not the behavior of someone whose mental illness was substantially impairing his ability to function in the world. The prosecution argued, It was the behavior of someone with a high degree of functional competence who chose when to present his illness and when to conceal it. The defense case rested entirely on the diminished responsibility claim, and James Chadwin presented it with the tools he had: the 4 psychiatric assessments. He called 2 of the 4 psychiatrists as defense witnesses, Dr. Hugo Milne and Dr. Malcolm Mackay. Both confirmed the paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis, and both were prepared to say that the divine mission delusion, in their assessment, substantially impaired Sutcliffe's responsibility for the killings. The voice from the graveyard, whether or not it had a genuine supernatural source, had been experienced by Sutcliffe as real, and he had acted in response to what he experienced as a divine command. Chadwin made the argument that the law provides for exactly this kind of case. A man who is, by medical consensus, seriously mentally ill, whose illness involves a systematized delusional belief that his actions are divinely authorized, and who cannot therefore be held to the same standard of moral and legal responsibility as a man who kills without any such belief. Whether or not the divine mission narrative was the genuine engine of his actions, he had genuinely internalized it as a belief system, and the 4 psychiatrists agreed on this point. The prosecution's rebuttal to the divine mission claim was specific and was delivered at the trial by Havers himself. There were 3 problems with the narrative, he argued. First, Sutcliffe had never mentioned the voice or the mission during any of his 9 police interviews. He had been asked about the murders on 9 separate occasions and had never offered a religious motivation or described hearing divine commands. The narrative appeared, apparently fully formed, only after his arrest and after his legal team had arranged psychiatric assessment. Second, his behavior during the murders showed deliberate protective action. He had driven to locations he had scouted, he had brought specific tools to each scene, he had returned to retrieve evidence. This was not consistent with psychotic compulsion. Third, the divine mission narrative, if genuine, would have produced some visible deviation from ordinary behavior in the years of killing. His colleagues, his wife, his friends, and 9 sets of interviewing police officers had observed nothing. The jury heard this argument and the counter-arguments at length. They heard the 4 psychiatrists. They heard the confession read in detail. They heard the survivor testimony. They deliberated for 4.5 days. On May 22nd, 1981, they returned verdicts of guilty of murder on all 13 counts by majority verdict. The diminished responsibility defense was rejected. Whether the jury rejected the psychiatric evidence, which would be extraordinary given that all 4 examiners agreed on the diagnosis, or whether they accepted the medical evidence but concluded that the legal threshold for substantial impairment had not been met, is not entirely clear from the formal record. Jury deliberations are private. What is clear is that the verdict was murder, 13 times, and that the system had concluded that Peter Sutcliffe bore full criminal responsibility for what he had done. Mr. Justice Boreham sentenced Sutcliffe to life imprisonment on each of the 13 murder counts, with the sentences to run concurrently. He then said something that was, in the context of the psychiatric evidence that had just been before the court, somewhat double-edged. He recommended that Sutcliffe serve a minimum of 30 years. He told Sutcliffe that he represented a substantial and enduring danger to women, and that the protection of the public was the paramount consideration in sentencing. The Home Secretary at the time, William Whitelaw, later affirmed this minimum recommendation. In 2010, a subsequent Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd, on review of the case, set a whole life tariff, meaning that Sutcliffe would never be considered for parole release. He would die in prison. There are 2 aspects of the legal proceedings that deserve additional reflection. The first is what the trial's outcome told us about the relationship between psychiatric evidence and jury decision-making in the British legal system. 4 psychiatrists, with no stake in the outcome other than their professional assessment, examined Sutcliffe extensively and all concluded that he had paranoid schizophrenia. The jury heard this evidence and convicted him of murder rather than manslaughter. This does not mean the jury was wrong in any simple sense. The legal question before them was not whether Sutcliffe was mentally ill, but whether his mental illness had substantially impaired his responsibility for murder. These are different questions, and a jury of non-specialists can legitimately assess the second question on the evidence, even when specialists have answered the first. But the gap between the psychiatric consensus and the jury verdict is not a comfortable gap, and it has continued to generate debate about the appropriate relationship between expert evidence and jury decision-making in cases involving mental illness. 2 years after his conviction, Sutcliffe was formally diagnosed again with paranoid schizophrenia by prison psychiatrists, and in 1984 he was transferred from the prison system to Broadmoor Hospital, the high-security psychiatric facility, for treatment of his condition. The diagnosis the trial had effectively set aside was confirmed and, in its institutional consequences, acted upon. He received antipsychotic medication that the prison system had not been administering. His condition was treated for the first time in a structured clinical setting. The second is the question that was not fully examined in the trial, but that haunted the case afterward: the language and the framing. The prosecutor had to deal, in presenting the victims' cases, with the fact that some of the women Sutcliffe had killed had been selling sex, and some had not. The way the trial record handled this was not always consistent in its respect for the women who sold sex. Phrases that distinguished between different categories of victim appeared in the evidence in ways that echoed the press coverage of the case. This was partly inevitable, in that the nature of the encounter for some victims was a fact of the case. But it was not entirely inevitable, and the degree to which the moral status of the victims was an implicit presence in the proceedings was noted by commentators at the time and has been noted more explicitly since. All 13 were murdered by the same man. The trial's outcome was the same for all 13, but the way the court heard about them was not always the same, and that asymmetry is part of the honest account of the case. Peter Sutcliffe was sent to HMP Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight following his conviction in May 1981. He arrived in a prison system that contained thousands of men convicted of serious offences, and that had no particular protocol for a man convicted of 13 murders who was nationally known as a monster. His fellow prisoners made their response to this clear almost immediately. In November 1983, an inmate named James Costello attacked Sutcliffe with a broken coffee jar and slashed his face severely, causing lacerations that required hospital treatment. This was reported publicly and generated a response that was itself instructive. Some people expressed concern that a prisoner had been able to attack another prisoner with a glass weapon, and others expressed something closer to satisfaction. The tension between these responses, and the institutional difficulty of protecting a man whom many people felt did not deserve protection, was a constant of his decades in custody. In January 1984, an inmate at Parkhurst named Paul Wilson attacked Sutcliffe and stabbed him in both eyes with the sharpened handle of broken spectacles. Sutcliffe lost significant vision as a result of this attack. The injury was permanent. In March 1984, following psychiatric assessments that confirmed the paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis and concluded that he required structured psychiatric treatment that the prison system could not provide, Sutcliffe was transferred to Broadmoor Hospital in Berkshire. Broadmoor is a high-security hospital operated by the National Health Service, housing patients who have been found not guilty by reason of insanity or who have been transferred from prison because of mental illness. Sutcliffe was placed in Headingley ward, where he would spend the next 32 years. At Broadmoor he received antipsychotic medication and the other clinical interventions appropriate to his diagnosis. He gained substantial weight. He socialized to a limited degree within the ward. He gave occasional interviews to journalists, including one in the late 1980s, in which he spoke about the victims in terms that were noted at the time and since as lacking anything recognizable as remorse. He spoke about his divine mission in terms that his treating psychiatrists noted were consistent with ongoing delusional thinking, though whether these expressions were genuine manifestations of continued psychotic belief or instrumental statements designed to support the mental illness narrative has never been definitively established. In 1997, he was attacked again by a fellow Broadmoor patient named Ian Kay, who gouged out one of Sutcliffe's eyes with a ballpoint pen. Kay was a convicted murderer who had been transferred from the prison system. He told staff afterward that he had attacked Sutcliffe because of what Sutcliffe had done to his victims. Whether Kay's stated reason represents genuine moral outrage or a more complex prison social dynamic is unclear. The result was that Sutcliffe lost the eye and was left with severely limited vision. In 2016, after a panel of assessors concluded that Sutcliffe no longer required the clinical environment that Broadmoor provided, he was transferred to HMP Frankland in County Durham, a Category A prison that housed other high-profile prisoners. He was by this point 70 years old. He had changed his name by deed poll to Coonan, his mother's maiden name, at some point during his time at Broadmoor, though this provided no practical anonymity in the prison system. On November 13, 2020, Peter Sutcliffe died at the University Hospital of North Durham, to which he had been transferred after a cardiac arrest at Frankland. The cause of death was given as COVID-19, complicated by heart and kidney disease. He had contracted the virus in prison. Medical staff reported that he had refused ventilation. He was 74 years old. His death was reported on the front pages of every national newspaper. The reactions were varied, and all of them were comprehensible. Some survivors and families of victims said they felt relief. Some said they felt a complicated grief, not for him, but for the finality of any remaining possibility that they might, someday, receive adequate answers to questions they still carried. Some members of the public expressed satisfaction. Some expressed regret that he had died before full accountability had been explored. The families of the 13 murdered women, having lived with those losses for between 40 and 45 years, had responses that were as varied as families and time and individual experience can produce. Sonia Sutcliffe had divorced Peter Sutcliffe in 1994. She had maintained throughout the case, and continued to maintain, that she had had no knowledge of her husband's crimes. She was never charged with any offence, and there was no legal finding against her. She resumed teaching and returned to private life. In 1992, she successfully sued the News of the World for publishing claims that she had known about the murders, and was awarded substantial damages. The question of what she knew or suspected remains, as a factual matter, unanswered in the public record. She has said what she has said. What she knew is something only she can confirm, and she has not confirmed anything beyond her maintained position of ignorance. John Humble, the man who sent the Wareside Jack letters and tape, was identified in 2005 through a cold case forensic technique that did not exist when the materials were originally received. DNA analysis of saliva from the envelope flaps. The saliva had been preserved, unanalyzed in this way, in the evidence storage of the inquiry for 26 years. When forensic technology advanced sufficiently to profile DNA from dried saliva on envelope adhesive, investigators ran the profiles against the National DNA Database. John Humble's DNA was on the database from an unrelated offence. The match was made. He was arrested in 2005. He pleaded guilty to 4 counts of perverting the course of justice in 2006 and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. He gave no adequate explanation for why he had done it. He said he had not realized the consequences. He said he was sorry. Neither explanation nor apology was sufficient to address what his hoax had actually cost, which was the investigative resources and the attention that were diverted to a man from Sunderland who did not exist while Peter Sutcliffe, a man from Bradford who very much existed, kept killing. The Byford report, formerly titled An Inquiry into the Case of the Yorkshire Ripper, was completed in 1982 by Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary Sir Lawrence Byford. It was a thorough and careful document that examined the inquiry in detail and reached conclusions that were painful but necessary. Sir Lawrence found that the management of the inquiry's information had been inadequate to the volume of data generated. He found that the index card system, while appropriate for smaller investigations, was structurally unable to support the cross-referencing requirements of an inquiry of this size. He found that Peter Sutcliffe had appeared in the inquiry files enough times that a properly organized system should have elevated him to high-priority suspect status years before his arrest. He found that the decision to treat the Wareside Jack tape as genuine had been made with insufficient skepticism and had distorted the investigation at a critical period. He was specific about this. The tape should have been subjected to more rigorous internal debate about its authenticity. The phonetics experts who confirmed the Wareside accent were providing an analysis of what the accent was, not of whether the tape was from the killer. The inference from one to the other was a further step that should have been questioned more rigorously. He found that evidence from surviving victims, particularly the detailed descriptions provided by Marcella Claxton and Marilyn Moore and the composite drawing produced from Moore's description, had not been adequately integrated into the investigation's profile work. He noted in careful but clear language that the race and status of the survivors had affected the weight given to their accounts. He found that the investigative priority assigned to different murders had been affected by the perceived status of the victims, with the result that the inquiry had consistently applied equal investigative resource to all cases in the series. He found that the failures of cross-force coordination between West Yorkshire, Bradford City and Greater Manchester had created gaps in information sharing that delayed the recognition of the full scope of the series. And he found that the inquiry had ultimately failed to catch the perpetrator through its own efforts. This sentence in the Byford report, its precision and its plainness, is one of the most damning assessments of a major investigation ever written by an official reviewer, and it was written with the authority of someone who had examined every aspect of the case and had concluded that what it found was not a matter of bad luck, but of systemic failure. The Byford report was initially classified. It was not released in full to the public for many years. The families of the victims who had lived through the failures it documented did not have access to its findings for a long time after those findings were made. This is itself a part of the case's aftermath that requires honest acknowledgement. The systematic review of the investigation's failures, which belonged to the public and to the victims' families as a matter of justice, was held behind an official classification that served no purpose that the public record has been able to identify. When the report was eventually made public in 2006, it confirmed what critics of the inquiry had been saying for 25 years. The changes that flowed from the Byford report transformed British policing in specific and significant ways. The most important single change was the development and deployment of Holmes, which was introduced in 1986 and became standard in all major British criminal inquiries. Holmes does for a major inquiry what the paper card system could not. It allows all information from all inquiry strands to be cross-referenced automatically, so that a name appearing in multiple different contexts generates a flag that a human investigator can see and act on. Had Holmes existed in 1977, the analysis is consistent across everyone who has examined the case. Peter Sutcliffe would have been identified and arrested years before he was. The reforms in cross-force coordination that followed the report have similarly been integrated into British policing practice in ways that addressed the gaps the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry had exposed. None of this brings back the women who died in the gap between when the inquiry should have found Sutcliffe and when it actually did. But it represents the institutional acknowledgement that a failure occurred and that the failure was preventable, and that acknowledgement, imperfect as it is the minimum that an honest account of the case requires. The survivors of Sutcliffe's attacks who did not die lived with their experiences in ways that were deeply individual and not always publicly visible. Marilyn Moore, who had given the most detailed composite description and whose account had not been adequately used, has spoken in subsequent years about the experience of surviving an attack by someone who then went on to kill many more times, and about the specific quality of that knowledge. Not just the trauma of the attack itself, but the knowledge of what followed it and the question of whether a different investigative response to her account might have changed what followed. Marcella Claxton, similarly, has been public about the experience of being a black woman whose account was not given the same weight as the accounts of white survivors, and about what it meant to live with that knowledge while the inquiry continued and more women died. The families of Wilma McCann, the first victim, have perhaps been most publicly present in the decades since the case closed, partly because of Richard McCann's work as a public speaker and author. Richard McCann's account of what it meant to be the child of the first Ripper victim, growing up in the specific shadow of how his mother had been portrayed, and the shame that had been attached to his family by that portrayal, is a document of the case's aftermath that the original coverage could not have produced. He has described the experience of being told as a child that his mother had been a prostitute, and the specific complexity of grief when the person you are grieving has been publicly characterized in terms that diminish her. He has spoken about what it meant to spend his childhood aware that the way people talked about his mother made it harder to talk about missing her. He has written and spoken about all of this with a clarity and a lack of bitterness that is, in itself, a kind of answer to the framing that shaped the original coverage. The broader social legacy of the Yorkshire Ripper case is not a clean or simple thing. It produced genuine institutional reform in homes and in the coordination procedures that improved subsequent major inquiries. It produced an important literature of critique of how sex workers are treated by the criminal justice system when they are victims of crime, a literature that has informed subsequent policy development in ways that are measurable, if not yet complete. It produced a sustained public engagement with the question of what it means for a society to assign different values to different women's safety based on what those women do for a living. But it also demonstrated, in a way that is difficult to argue away, that the recognition of those different values and the reform of the systems that express them is a slow and contested process. The specific institutional attitudes that affected the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry did not disappear the moment the inquiry ended. They changed over decades, unevenly, incompletely, in response to sustained pressure from advocates and reformers and the families of victims who refused to let the question close. That process is not yet complete. It may not be complete for some time. What the honest account of the Yorkshire Ripper case tells us, if we look at it without the comfort of resolution, is that the world Wilma McCann and Emily Jackson and Irene Richardson and Patricia Atkinson and the 9 women after them were killed in was a world that did not treat all women's safety as equally important, and that this was not a hidden or marginal attitude, but one embedded in institutions and expressed in language and made visible in the specific way an inquiry ran for 5 years and failed. The reforms that followed are evidence that this can change. The length of time the inquiry ran and the number of lives lost in it are evidence that changing it takes longer than it should. There is a question that sits at the end of every account of this case, and it is not the question of guilt, which was established by confession and confirmed by forensic evidence and jury verdict. It is a different kind of question, quieter and harder to set aside. The £5 note was found in October 1977, 3 months after Jane MacDonald's death and more than 2 years before the arrest. It led, within weeks, to Peter Sutcliffe's name. He was interviewed in November 1977, and he was released. Between November 1977 and January 1981, 6 more women were murdered. Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritker, Vera Millwood, Josephine Whittaker, Barbara Leach, Marguerite Walls, and Jacqueline Hill. 7 women, if you count Yvonne Pearson, Helen Ritker, and Vera Millwood, whose deaths came before the tape arrived and cannot be attributed to the hoax's influence. 6 women after the note was traced and the name was in the file. 6 women in the gap between when the investigation had what it needed and when it used it. This is the sentence that the families of Yvonne Pearson and Helen Ritker and Vera Millwood and Josephine Whittaker and Barbara Leach and Marguerite Walls and Jacqueline Hill carry, not a sentence in the legal sense, a sentence in the plain sense, an account of what happened and when and in what order, and what the honest reading of that sequence means. Sir Lawrence Byford wrote that the inquiry failed to catch the perpetrator through its own efforts. He was caught by chance. These were the words of the official review, written in 1982, by a man who had examined every file and every decision and every missed connection. The plainness of those words has a weight that accumulates the longer you spend with this case. And yet, and this is also part of the honest account, the specific technological limitation that was the structural heart of the failure has been addressed. Holmes exists. Cross-force coordination exists in a form it did not exist in 1977. The forensic capability to identify DNA from envelope adhesive, which caught John Humble, existed by 2005 when it was used, and would have been used earlier if the technology had existed earlier. The institutional reforms that followed the Byford report are real and have consequences that are measurable in the outcomes of subsequent major inquiries. This does not mean the case is a story with a satisfying institutional resolution. It means the institutional failure was of the kind that can be partially remedied, and that partial remediation happened, which is better than nothing, and less than what the 13 murdered women deserved, and those two facts coexist without resolution. The divine mission narrative that Sutcliffe offered, and that 4 psychiatrists assessed as consistent with genuine paranoid schizophrenia, adds another layer to what the case means, and what it honestly does not resolve. Whether Peter Sutcliffe killed because he was mentally ill in a specific way, or whether the mental illness was present alongside a different engine of violence, or whether the divine mission was a constructed narrative that appeared after the fact and served legal purposes, is a question the psychiatric and legal records have answered in different ways, and that the man himself never answered in a way that satisfied anyone who examined it. He died in November 2020 without providing clarity on the question his mental state had raised throughout his legal proceedings and his decades of custody. What we know is that 13 women are dead. What we know is that the investigation that was supposed to find the man responsible took 5 years, employed hundreds of officers, cost tens of millions of pounds, and was ultimately concluded not by any investigative breakthrough, but by a routine traffic stop in Sheffield. What we know is that during those 5 years, decisions were made, assumptions were carried, and a hoax was believed, and that each of these things cost time that could not be recovered. The women whose names I want to speak now were not cautionary figures. They were not illustrations of anything. They were people, complete and specific and real, in the years before they were killed, and the speaking of their names is the minimum that honest engagement with this case requires. Wilma McCann was 28 years old. She had 4 children. She had energy and humour that people who knew her still described decades later. She had £1.88 in her pocket and a quarter-mile to walk. Emily Jackson was 42 years old. She was trying to hold her family together through a difficult time. She liked the Gaiety pub and was liked there. Irene Richardson was 28 years old. She had come south from Glasgow looking for something. She had children she was separated from, and that separation was its own grief. Patricia Atkinson was 32 years old, and everyone called her Tina. Her flat was supposed to be safe. Jane MacDonald was 16 years old. She had been dancing. Her father said she was a good girl. She was. They all were. That was never the question. Jean Jordan was 20 years old. She had moved to Manchester with her boyfriend and their 2 children. She wanted something better than she had had. Yvonne Pearson was 21 years old. Her children waited for her for 3 months without knowing where she was. Helen Rietka was 18 years old. She and her twin sister had tried to keep each other safe. They had thought about the danger and planned for it, and the plan was not enough. Vera Millwood was 40 years old. She had 7 children. She was often in pain. She kept going. Josephine Whittaker was 19 years old. She was walking home from her grandparents' house across a park she had crossed many times. Barbara Leach was 20 years old. She left the pub a few minutes after her friends. She walked a familiar route in the dark, and she almost made it. Marguerite Walls was 47 years old. She had built a professional life over decades. She was working late. Jacqueline Hill was 20 years old. She was reading English literature. She was from Middlesbrough. She stepped off a bus 100 metres from her hall of residence on a Monday evening in November, and the walk was so short that she had nearly done it before she was stopped. These are the names this case has always been about: the investigation, the hoax, the trial, the reforms, the institutional failures, and their partial remediation. All of it is the record of what happened around and because of the deaths of these 13 women. They are the reason the case matters and the reason it will continue to matter for as long as we are honest about what it reveals. The case is closed. Peter Sutcliffe died in a prison hospital on November 13th, 2020, of COVID-19, which he had contracted in custody. He was 74 years old. He had refused a ventilator. Whether that refusal represents something in him that we can attach meaning to, or whether it was simply the decision of an old and sick man in a hospital room, is not a question the record resolves. What the record does resolve, in its totality, is this: 13 women were killed. The investigation that was supposed to find the killer failed in ways that were specific and preventable, and that have been honestly documented. The man who killed them was eventually caught by chance, was tried, was convicted, and is dead. The institutional responses to the investigation's failures produced real and significant changes to how major inquiries are conducted in Britain. And the names remain. They always remain. Speak them. Do not let them become shorthand. Do not let the case absorb them. They were people first, and they deserve to be known as the people they were, in the specific fullness of lives that were interrupted before they were finished. That is what the honest account of the Yorkshire Ripper case requires.